They were practicing this morning the Let There Be Peace on Earth, and I asked Susan, I said, didn't we just sing this? And she said, yes. I had planned this months ago, and you just picked it a couple of weeks ago. And at the same time, I am so grateful to be able to hear it again so soon, because with all the news in the world and the happenings going on, it's a reminder of the call in our prayer and for us not to give up offering and seeking and chasing after peace in all that we do. So you can sing it again next week as far as I'm concerned, because that was beautiful. And in the midst of this, kind of the situation that we find ourselves in the world, these texts kind of rattled around in my brain for far too long, perhaps. And somebody might say not long enough yet. But at the same time, it speaks to me, and what I've heard here in both of these are this kind of idea of journey. And I thought, we're in a whole different place of journeying in our world. We're journeying through the pandemic. We're journeying through watching the Afghanistan change over to Taliban control again. We're watching the news. We're watching a hurricane go into the Northeast in a place that doesn't typically get Northeast before hurricane season even starts. I mean, this stuff gets to be just mind-boggling and unsettling. And these disciples that heard directly from the words of Jesus, that began to follow after him, the further they got into the journey and the more that they understand what was going on, and Jesus begins to teach more and more, the verse that really resonated in a lot of ways in my mind was the idea that they heard what he said and they couldn't, and they stopped following after him. Oh, I've seen it more than once. The deepness and the excitement of a newfound Christian that comes into the faith and is gung-ho for Jesus. And as the things kind of wade away and just the normalcy of life ekes in. I mean, we can't all live on a mountaintop experience all the time. And so we begin to drift further and further and further away from Jesus. I'll admit, sometimes it's the preacher's fault, too. Sometimes even the church can get a little rough around the edges and less than hospitable. And yet at the same time, the church and the preacher are never Jesus. Oftentimes we need to hear that over and over again. I have taken some little art kits around to the kids, and one of them met me at the door one day, opened the door, saw who I was. I had my mask on. He says, "Oh, look, it's Jesus." I thought that's the best compliment I've ever gotten. I realize I'm not Jesus. I always remember my theology professor's idea. He said the one thing that he realizes every morning when he wakes up and he's offering Thanksgiving prayers to God, the first and the last that he offered was the fact that he wasn't God. Thank God I'm not God. To have to deal with the world and the situation and the people and it'd be tough. I'm not envious. But I am grateful. I'm grateful for the God that kind of continues to stir in the world and in my soul and in my being, and causes me day after day to decide to try to follow after Jesus as best I can. I guarantee y'all could come up with a list for me that I didn't get right. And I'm trying to do better. But there's a journey, there's a beginning, there's a process. And for some people who get involved, I mean, when we put this water of baptism on a little infant's head or on an adult person or a 115-year-old person, they don't know enough to fully be able to make that decision to follow after God. Baptism comes as a gift through God's grace into our life that guides us and helps us realize that we need to lead upon God's gift of grace in our life, upon God's sacraments, This water is just a small outward sign of what's happening in our heart and in our lives. We don't ever know enough to be able to have all the answers and to possess. So I can identify sometimes with these disciples that maybe said, well, I got in here a little too far. I don't know. I just can't do this anymore. I could see maybe how some folks might come up with it, but I would encourage, I would suggest, I would ask, I would beg, I would plead to stick with it. Keep going on the journey. Don't stop. Don't let people get in your way. Don't let the church stand in your way or the preacher, me or another one. Continue to follow after Christ in all that we do, so that we can become the disciples. So that we can say with the words of Peter that you are the Holy One. You are the one. Not me, not what I want, not what I think, but you alone, O Christ, are the Holy One. That revelation helps us and helps us to see in a different way and to journey on the faith. When I was really reading through these, where I figured we would go would be the Psalm, which is where we're going to get. Because it was kind of that idea and that understanding of a journey. I don't know, you've probably perhaps think I talk too much about journeying in the way of faith and kind of this effort to keep moving forward, moving on, and that's all I've ever known. Is part of what faith is a process of growing. It's not just an instantaneously once done and done. It's a process. In the Methodist Church, in Methodist theology, we call that sanctifying grace. That it's a process that is lifelong. And it isn't on our own effort. Yeah, there's a combination of an effort. There's our own will and there's our own desire. But there's also God's grace growing in and through us, and our ability to understand God's presence in our lives and in our world, and to never, ever, ever give up on that. But it's a process. It takes us from a place where we might just be clamoring and trying to keep afloat to a place where our life is offered up in praise and thanksgiving of all that God has done for us and for our world, to never get discouraged enough to give up, to begin to hold fast, strong to the faith and to God's ability, not our ability. But I got to thinking about these people that were journeying in Psalm 84. From what I understand, Psalm 84 is really this kind of, it's a pilgrimage psalm. They're going to the temple to praise God. In the true Jewish understanding, in the old system and the old understanding, before the temple was destroyed in 70, the only place to truly worship God was in Jerusalem. Now that's fine. You know, it's kind of like, perhaps like a county seat. They didn't have cars, they didn't have public transportation, they had some boats and they had some sandals, and a donkey or two. That's how they got around. So to be able to worship in purity and in fullness, they had to be in the temple, so they had to go to the temple from time to time. Oh, that was part of it. And getting into that part, you're like, how do they get there? I don't know, I thought maybe perhaps it's like Canterbury Tales, that they were on a journey to Canterbury. Maybe that's something that we might be able to identify a little bit with, but, leave off some of those characters. But the idea of journeying, now I can identify with that, especially, like it's summertime. Some of us from time to time get to take a trip a little bit of ways. Do you remember some of those games you used to play in the car when you were driving? When there were old 2-lane roads and you had to go through a bunch of cow pastures, what'd you do? You divided up. The people on the left-hand side of the car, Kathy did this all the time. You just did it, last week? You and Fred riding around counting cows? The people on the left side car, they're counting cows, and the people on the right side of the cars, they count their cows. And what happens? Whoever has the most cows is winning the game, right? Until you get to a cemetery. Oh man, what do you got to do when you get to the cemetery? You got to bury all the cows. Yep, and start over. There's another one that I remember hearing about too. You could play with, license tags. You know, you could spot who had the most different license tags that they would see. Or you could even do license tags. This is for the advanced students. You could do license tags by the alphabet. So you had to find an A, and then you had to find a B, C, whatever. Yep. Those games you play that you on a journey. So we might can identify a little bit and thank goodness that these people's chant and their song and their praise was a whole lot better than counting a bunch of cows. They were journeying to the temple to be able to praise and to worship and to offer up. Perhaps some scholars suggest that this is kind of like a call and response kind of prayer, almost like what we've done at Call to Worship, or perhaps in the army when they're running along, you've got one person say something and another person. The fire department trains, or police department trains, and sometimes they'll run down by the trail that's by Benjamin Parkway, and you can hear them doing this cadence back and forth and back and forth. Perhaps something like that might have been what was going on here. We don't know. A couple lines tell us in verse 8 that it's an individual psalm. It's "Hear my." And in verse 9 it says talk about our. So it's both individually and collective. It's important. Don't leave someone completely out. It's not just about me and Jesus, it's about us too. And over in my mind, I hear this idea of going into the temple and a presence of awing. One of our Methodist churches in Winston-Salem, they're worshiping in person today again for the first time since March of 2020. I can't imagine how in the world they could have done that. They could, I'm sure they could, and they've got a lot of tech gurus, and they could have done it, but there's just something about being in the presence of a worship space, either in person or online. I mean, there's a part of this that begins to shake us and move us. And when you walk into this space, we realize that it's just not the grocery store, and it's not the car dealership. That there is a difference in a presence of this place. And part of that is its beauty. I mean, it's, structurally beautiful, I think. I mean, this windows are just, the sun coming through is just beautiful today. But perhaps part of it that makes it more important and more special is the generations and the peoples that have come before us in this place and offered it up as a holy place. Who've offered prayers for their time, their struggles, and have remembered just once in a while to pray for the future within this place. It begins to shake and to move and to stir within us. Oh, the very idea and the gratitude and the gift to be able to add our prayers into their prayers for the world around us. It's not lost on me that the sanctuary, that the cornerstone was laid in 1919. You know what was happening then? We've heard plenty about it during this pandemic. Was the Spanish flu of 1918. Somehow in the midst of what they were going on, they figured out a way to keep moving forward in this edifice. Place that one day that they knew that people would come together and fill it and sing and pray. Oh, they saw through that. And they perhaps didn't know what was going on either. They didn't know how long it was going to take, but they knew that the God who had brought them to that place was going to take them on to where they were going. Oh, it's this stirring. It's moving. I went over to Home Depot this week. I hadn't been there in about 3 weeks. I'm surprised they didn't send out a search party. But and I got to thinking, and all out through there, the garden section, if I were one of those birds, I might be there too. And they've done everything in the world to try to run those birds off. They've moved the bird seed inside. They've hidden the plants. They've even put up those spiky things on top shelves. They've set up these speakers that screech like an owl. And yet those crazy little birds just keep flying around and making themselves at home. I think it's interesting that the psalmist took enough time to think about the inside of the temple and to talk about these little sparrows, that they too could find a place nearby in the temple, that they could actually, the swallow could build a nest and care for her young there. Oh, what a powerful image. A couple years ago, I had a little wreath on my front door. And this, I guess it's a house finch, decided that the center of my wreath, on the very top part of it, was the place that she was going to build a nest. And she did. There were about 4 or 5 little birds. Now, what makes this really comical, sort of, unless I guess you're a postal worker, is that my mail slot is about 6 inches below that nest. So can you imagine that? You walk up, you lift the little gate thing for the door, and you slide the mail through there, and there's a bird comes right out at you. I was a little worried about that, but I think the bird and the mail people got along okay. But the very idea of the front of my door becoming her home. Oh, how cool is that? I didn't care that the little droppings ran all down the front of the door, and it ate away the paint on my door. I was just so enamored that little bird found a home, that she could raise little chicks. Make a difference in the world. I know there's plenty of birds, there's plenty of places, but I was glad they made their nest on my door. Perhaps this psalmist reminds us that coming to the temple, coming to church, to worshiping God however we can, as best we can, in the ways that we can, makes a difference in our world. It does nurture and sustain not only ourselves and our spirit, but others. It helps us to care for one another, even when it's inconvenient and frustrating and aggravating and, all those things that wear us out. It makes a difference. And as teachers and students start back to school this week, as students at the universities begin classes, as people begin new jobs, new experiences, and new opportunities, it's a decision that we can make and understand, and it's an ability. It's a prayer. It's our offering to God. How we deal with folks, how we interact, how we make a difference, how we go off into new worlds and do new things. We know that God's already there. We know that God's cared for us for a long time, many of us. And God will continue always to care for us, for we are God's beloved children. All glory, honor, and power be to the one who was, who is, and who is to come. Amen.